Imagine closing off your own driveway for some repairs only to have your nosy neighbor call 911 on you. Sounds ridiculous, right? Well, that's exactly what happened to me. But what Karen didn't know was that her little stunt would lead to a huge discovery, something that would turn the whole situation upside down. Karen was the kind of neighbor everyone tried to avoid. She always had something to say about how other people lived their lives. Whether it was complaining about someone's lawn, making a fuss over trash cans, or acting like she ran the whole neighborhood, Karen always found a reason to stick her nose where it didn't belong. I had dealt with her nonsense before, but this time, she took things way too far. One morning, I had to close off my driveway for some work. Nothing crazy, just some maintenance that required blocking it for a little while. The moment Karen saw the barriers, she marched right over, demanding to know what I was doing. "It's my driveway," I told her. "I'm doing some work on it." Karen wasn't happy with that answer. She started going on about how I was blocking access and making things inconvenient for the neighborhood. I reminded her again that this was my property and I didn't need her permission. That's when she completely lost it. Before I could even process what was happening, she pulled out her phone and called the cops on me. Over my own driveway. I just stood there, completely dumbfounded. What could she even tell them? That I was working on my property? I figured the cops would show up, realize how ridiculous this was, and leave. But what none of us expected was what the workers would find under my driveway. And once that happened, oh, Karen was in for a big surprise. But before we continue, I'm on a road to 1,000 subscribers as a small channel. If you want to help me reach my goal, please watch the video until the end and subscribe if you like this type of content. I would really appreciate it. Now let's continue. If you've ever had a nosy neighbor, you know how annoying it can be. But Karen? She was on another level. She wasn't just nosy, she acted like she owned the whole neighborhood. From the moment I moved in, Karen made it clear that she had an opinion about everything. She had lived in the area for years and seemed to think that gave her the right to police everyone else's property. She wasn't part of any HOA, but that didn't stop her from acting like she was. At first, I tried to keep things civil. I would nod and smile when she gave her unsolicited advice about lawn care. I even let it slide when she reminded me about trash pickup days as if I didn't already know. But the longer I lived there, the more I realized that Karen wasn't just annoying, she was a control freak. She would complain about where people parked their cars, even if they were parked legally. Leave passive-aggressive notes on doors about things like overgrown bushes or Christmas lights staying up too long. Call the city over the most minor things, like a neighbor leaving their trash cans out a few hours too late. And, of course, she hated anything that changed the way the neighborhood looked. If someone painted their house a new color, she had something to say about it. If a new fence went up, she'd ask if they got it approved. She acted like she was the guardian of the community's aesthetic, even though no one had ever asked for her input. I mostly ignored her, but Karen had a way of making everything a big deal. A few months before the driveway incident, she had thrown a fit because my friend parked in front of my house for the afternoon. She came over, knocking aggressively on my door, saying, "Your guest is blocking the street." I looked outside. My friend's car was parked perfectly fine, not blocking anyone's driveway or anything. I told her, "It's a public street, Karen. They can park there." Her face turned red and she stormed off, muttering something about neighborhood standards. That's when I knew Karen wasn't just annoying. She loved control, and when she couldn't control something, she lost it. So when I blocked off my driveway for some work, I should have seen it coming. But even then, I never imagined she'd actually call the cops on me. It all started on a Saturday morning. I'd scheduled a crew to come over and work on my driveway. I was planning on getting it repaved. It was cracked and uneven, and it was finally time to take care of it. I put up some temporary barriers to make sure no one accidentally parked there or tried to walk through while the work was being done. It seemed like a simple, straightforward plan. But, of course, nothing was ever that simple with Karen around. As soon as the crew started unloading their equipment, I saw Karen peeking out from her window. Less than 5 minutes later, she was out of her house and headed straight toward me, looking angry. "What's going on here?" she demanded. I explained, I'm having my driveway repaved. It'll be blocked off for a little while. Karen narrowed her eyes. You can't just close off access like this. I was confused. It's my driveway. I'm not blocking the street or anyone else's property. She shook her head. This affects the whole neighborhood. What if someone needs to turn around here? You didn't think about that, did you? Now, I knew Karen liked to make a fuss, but this was ridiculous. Karen, it's my driveway. It'll be done in a day or two, and it's not blocking anyone. She crossed her arms and glared at me like I had committed some kind of crime. You need to move those barriers. You can't just do whatever you want. I tried to keep my cool. I'm not moving anything. This is perfectly legal, and I'm not asking for permission. Karen's face turned red. Fine. If you're going to be difficult, I'll handle this myself. Before I could ask what she meant, she pulled out her phone and started dialing. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe she was calling a friend to complain, but when she started saying, yes, I'd like to report an incident, I realized she was actually calling the police. Over a driveway repair. I couldn't believe it. I tried to interrupt her. Karen, are you seriously calling the cops right now? Over this? She waved me off and continued her conversation. I heard her describing the situation, making it sound like I was causing a public hazard. She even said something about how my barriers were putting people's safety at risk. I just stood there, stunned. Was this real life? Who calls the cops over someone working on their own property? But Karen was determined. She finished her call, looked at me with a smug expression, and said, You'll see. You can't just disrupt the neighborhood like this. At that moment, I figured the cops would show up, see how ridiculous this was, and move on. Little did I know, things were about to take a very unexpected turn. About 15 minutes after Karen's ridiculous 911 call, I saw a police car pulling up to my house. I couldn't believe it. She had actually wasted police resources over this. 2 officers stepped out, looking around like they were expecting something serious. I could only imagine what Karen had told them. She probably made it sound like I had put up barbed wire and was holding the whole neighborhood hostage. Karen, of course, marched right over to them, acting like she was some kind of hero. Thank you for coming, officers. I need you to do something about this. One of the officers, a guy who looked like he'd seen his fair share of nonsense calls, sighed and asked, All right, ma'am, what seems to be the issue? Karen gestured dramatically toward my driveway. He's completely blocked it off. It's a safety hazard, and it's preventing people from accessing the street. The officer looked at my driveway, then back at her. Ma'am, this is his property. Yes, but he's disrupting the neighborhood. What if there's an emergency? What if people need to turn around? The second officer, a younger guy, tried to hold back a laugh. You called 911 for this? Karen crossed her arms looking offended. I had no choice. He refused to listen to me. The first officer turned to me. Sir, what's going on here? I shrugged. I'm just having my driveway repaved. I put up some barriers so nobody walks through by accident. That's it. The officer nodded. Yeah, that's perfectly fine. You're not breaking any laws. I could see Karen's face twisting with frustration. She wasn't getting her way, and it was killing her. So you're just going to let him do this? What about the community? What about safety? The younger cop sighed. Ma'am, there's no law against someone working on their own driveway. I thought that would be the end of it. The cops would tell Karen to stop wasting their time, and they'd leave. But just as I was about to relax, one of the workers called out. Hey, boss? You might want to see this. I turned around and saw that the crew had broken through a section of my old concrete, but instead of just dirt underneath, there was something else. A hollow space. One of the workers grabbed a flashlight and shined it down. Looks like some kind of tunnel or old foundation. The police officers, now suddenly interested, walked over. A tunnel? One of them asked. The worker nodded. Yeah, it's not just a small hole. There's a whole space down here. The first officer crouched down to take a look. That's unusual. He turned to me. Did you know this was here? I shook my head. No idea. I thought it was just solid ground under there. The worker grabbed some tools to clear more debris, and as the dust settled, we got a better look. The space beneath my driveway wasn't natural. There were bricks, old wooden beams, and even what looked like a metal box. The cops exchanged glances. Suddenly, this wasn't just a neighbor dispute anymore. One of them pulled out his radio. We might need to get someone down here to check this out. Karen, who had been standing there watching, suddenly looked very, very nervous. She had no idea what she had just gotten herself into. The moment the police realized something unusual was under my driveway, the entire situation changed. What started as Karen's petty complaint had suddenly turned into a real investigation. One of the officers radioed for backup while the other started asking me more questions. You said you had no idea this was here? I shook my head. None at all. I've lived here for years and I never noticed anything weird. The construction workers cleared more of the rubble, revealing what looked like an entrance, a passage leading underground. The metal box we had seen earlier was covered in dirt, but one of the workers carefully pulled it out and set it aside. It looked old, rusted, and heavy. Karen, who had been standing there completely silent, finally spoke up. This can't be anything important. Probably just some old junk. I turned to her, raising an eyebrow. You seem nervous, Karen. Her face went pale. I just don't think we should blow this out of proportion. It's probably nothing. The officer ignored her and called in for a specialist to come take a look at the underground structure. Another officer arrived shortly after, and within minutes, my driveway had become a crime scene. One of the cops carefully opened the metal box, and we all leaned in to see what was inside. It was full of old documents, photographs, and what looked like some kind of ledger. The papers were yellowed and brittle, but some of the writing was still visible. The officer lifted one of the documents carefully. This looks like property records, but these are decades old. Another worker, still looking into the tunnel, called out, guys, I think this goes deeper than we thought. The police quickly roped off the area, preventing anyone from getting too close. What started as a simple driveway repair had now become a full-blown investigation into whatever was hidden beneath my house. And Karen? She was freaking out. She kept shifting on her feet, glancing toward the officers like she wanted to say something, but didn't know how. Finally, she blurted out, Maybe we should just cover it back up. It's probably not important. One of the cops gave her a sharp look. Why are you so concerned, ma'am? Karen stammered. I just don't think we need to make a big deal out of this. It's just some old junk. No reason to waste police time, right? I folded my arms. You were happy to waste their time over my driveway. Why the sudden change of heart? She had no response. She just stood there looking guilty as hell. The officers weren't buying it either. Ma'am, one of them asked, do you know something about this? Karen quickly shook her head. Of course not. I've lived here a long time, that's all. That's when it hit me. Karen had lived in the neighborhood for decades. She was always acting like she knew everything about everyone's property. What if she already knew about what was under my driveway? The police seemed to have the same thought. One of them stepped closer. Ma'am, you wouldn't happen to know what this tunnel was used for, would you? Karen looked like she wanted to run. I really need to go home. The officer stopped her. Not yet. We'll need to ask you some more questions. As they escorted her toward the police car, she shot me a furious glare. This was not how she expected things to go. She called the cops on me, hoping to make my life miserable, but instead, she got caught up in something much bigger than either of us realized. And soon, we'd all find out exactly what that was. With Karen now under suspicion, the police focused on what exactly was hidden beneath my driveway. More officers arrived, along with a specialist who carefully examined the tunnel and the old metal box we had pulled out. At this point, my driveway looked more like an archaeological dig site than a home renovation project. The workers had uncovered more of the underground space, and it became clear that this wasn't just some random hole. This was a hidden structure. One of the officers carefully climbed down with a flashlight, looking around. After a few minutes, he called up, "This looks like an old storage bunker." A bunker? Under my house? My mind was racing. Who built this? And more importantly, why? The officer continued his search while the rest of us stood above, waiting for answers. Eventually, he climbed back up, holding more old documents and a small, rusted metal container. He handed them over to another officer who carefully opened it. Inside were several old, faded envelopes, all stamped with dates from over 50 years ago. Some of them had official-looking seals, while others looked like personal letters. One of the detectives on site skimmed through a document and muttered, "This is interesting." I leaned closer. "What is it?" He frowned. "It looks like financial records, but not the kind you'd expect. These are handwritten notes, tracking money, names, and dates." Karen, who had been silent for a while, suddenly spoke up. This doesn't mean anything. It's just old paperwork." The detective shot her a look. "You seem awfully concerned about something you claim to know nothing about." Karen's face turned pale. "I just don't think we need to make a big deal out of it." The officer ignored Karen and kept going through the papers. Then, after a few moments, he paused. He picked up one of the old documents and his eyes widened. He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, what's your last name?" Karen hesitated. "Why does that matter?" The officer held up the document. "Because this paper has a signature on it, and it matches your last name." My jaw dropped. "Wait, what?" The officer nodded. "This bunker and these records, someone in Karen's family was involved." Karen visibly tensed. "That's ridiculous. That's not mine." The officer looked at the signature again. "Well, unless there's another Karen with your last name who lived here decades ago, I'd say this might be something you need to explain." At this point, everyone was staring at her. The workers, the cops. She clenched her fists. "It's not what you think." One of the officers held up one of the envelopes. "Well, let's find out." He carefully opened it and pulled out a yellowed letter. As he read, his expression changed from curiosity to serious concern. He looked at Karen. "Ma'am, do you know anything about illegal banking operations?" The air went completely silent. Karen froze. What?" The detective held up the letter. "This is a written account of what looks like an underground money laundering operation. And the person who wrote this? They signed it with your last name." I blinked. Did my neighbor's family run some kind of illegal operation under my house? Karen looked like she was going to pass out. That's impossible." One of the officers sighed. "Well, it's not looking great for you, ma'am." The detective turned back to me. "It looks like at some point this property, before you owned it, was used as part of some kind of financial scheme. We'll need to investigate further, but this is definitely historical evidence of illegal activity." I shook my head in disbelief. "So, let me get this straight. Karen called the cops on me over my own driveway and ended up exposing her own family's criminal history?" The officer smirked. "Pretty much." I couldn't help it. I laughed. This was karma at its absolute finest. Karen, on the other hand, looked like she wanted to disappear. "I didn't know. I swear I didn't know about any of this." One of the officers tilted his head. "That's funny. You seemed awfully eager for us to cover it back up earlier. Almost like you didn't want anyone to find it." Karen didn't have an answer for that. She just looked at the ground, avoiding everyone's stares. At that point, the police had way bigger concerns than my driveway. They told me they'd need to continue investigating the bunker and that forensic teams would likely be involved. Meanwhile, Karen was told she might be questioned further, especially since her last name was all over those documents. She stormed back to her house, slamming the door behind her. I had a feeling this wouldn't be the last time she'd hear about this. As for me, well, I just stood there, trying not to laugh at how perfectly this all backfired on her. She called 911 to get me in trouble, and ended up getting her own family's shady past exposed instead. I couldn't have planned a better revenge if I'd tried. In the days that followed, my driveway was still a mess, but honestly, it was worth it. The police continued their investigation into the bunker, bringing in experts to carefully uncover more of what was hidden below. It turned out that the underground space had been sealed off for decades, forgotten by everyone, except apparently Karen's family. The documents they found confirmed that, at some point in the past, someone connected to Karen had been running an illegal financial scheme. The details were still being pieced together, but from what I heard, it involved money laundering, secret transactions, and hidden assets, all from right under my house. And Karen? Oh, she was absolutely humiliated. Word spread fast around the neighborhood, and soon everyone knew about her family's shady past. The woman who always acted like she was better than everyone else, who called the cops over the smallest things, had been caught up in an actual police investigation. She stopped talking to me completely. No more complaints, no more passive-aggressive remarks. She avoided me like the plague. And honestly, I loved every second of it. The best part? She had no one to blame but herself. If she had just minded her own business, if she had never called 911 over my driveway, none of this would have ever come to light. But she pushed too hard, and karma pushed right back. Eventually, the police finished their investigation, and I was finally able to get my driveway repaved. But every time I walked over it, I couldn't help but laugh, knowing that beneath my feet was the very thing that exposed Karen's past. A few months later, Karen put her house up for sale. I wasn't surprised. Her reputation in the neighborhood was completely ruined. As for me, I never had to deal with her nonsense again, and all it took was a driveway repair. Moral of the story? Maybe if Karen had just minded her own business, she wouldn't have ended up in the biggest mess of her life. But she just couldn't help herself. And that, my friends, is what you call poetic justice.